The question we're asking in this series as we get started is this important question: what brings lasting fulfillment? What is it that gives us a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose? And before I tell the following story to open up the message, it's important for you to understand that I have some advanced degrees that I've earned from accredited academic institutions, because you're going to question that in just a moment when I tell you the story. When I was a kid, 10, 11 years old, I was at my grandma's house, my great-grandma's house. I call her Big Granny. And Big Granny, I was at her house, and I was hungry, and I saw there out on the table in front of me, there was a plate of apple chips. And so, well, they looked good. So I was hungry. I put the first apple chip in my mouth, and the initial taste was a little bit off-putting, but you start chewing it, and it tastes like an apple after a while. So I ate the first little apple chip and swallowed it down into my belly, and so I'm still hungry. So I ate the second apple chip, the third apple chip, and I continued to eat these apple chips. And then at some point, my mom came into the room, and she looked at what I was doing. She just started laughing. She says, "Son, what are you doing?" So I'm eating these apple chips. Well, these apple chips were scented apples, also known as potpourri. And what we all learn at some point in our lives is that our lives function far better when we know the purpose for which things exist. And we also, at some point, come to understand this, that our lives function far better when we come to understand the purpose for which we exist. I believe God has created us with this hunger, this desire for a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. And we've all observed this at some point, that while we do what we do, the reason, the purpose behind it is oftentimes just as important as what we do. You may be familiar with the lady who's walking along the street, and she sees a man over on the sidewalk, and he's sluggish, he's not in a good mood, he's kind of moving around, and she asks him what he's doing. And at the particular time, he had a big bunch of rocks there in a pile, and he was taking one rock and placing it on top of another, and he had his masonry tools there. And she says to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm stacking rocks." And the lady goes on, same road, same little area, and she finds another young man who he's there, and he's energetic, he's excited, he has enthusiasm. He's doing the same thing. He's taking rocks and stacking them together. And she says to this young man, wondering what the difference is between the first man and the second man, "What is it that you're doing?" And to that, he turns and points, and he says, "I'm building a castle." There's a big difference in the person who understands their purpose and the person who doesn't. And today, as we think about this topic of purpose and wrapping out this series, it may be in your life, you feel like when you go to work, you're stacking rocks. You're writing reports. You're giving interviews. You're setting an agenda. When you are raising your family right now, and you're changing diapers, and you're washing clothes, it may feel like you're stacking rocks. But today, what I'd like to do is to not just look at how it is that we're arranging the rocks. I'd like for us to take a step back and look at the castle. And look at the bigger picture of what God calls us into as we seek to discover our life's purpose. And what I think we'll find is that there is a connection between our purpose and our passion. And when we really start to drill into what God's purpose for our life is, that's when we start to experience meaningful passion, lasting significance. If you find a person, and perhaps you've been this person, who doesn't have a sense of purpose, what you'll find inevitably is a person who is experiencing one of two things: either distraction or depression. When we approach life as if it's just stacking rocks, there's no bigger objective reason for which we're doing this, we end up distracting ourselves in a myriad of different ways, or we just end up down and depressed. So today, if you'll open with me to 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to look at what I believe our purpose in life is. This particular topic is a message that could be preached from multitudes of texts in both the Old and the New Testament. And what I want to do from Peter is in the two verses we're going to look at, show you today what the two core purposes of our life are and how they connect with what we've been studying so far in this series. So 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to begin in verse 9. If you read with me the word of the Lord. And Peter says to the people, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession." And so here Peter speaks to the identity of the people. He'll do the same thing in the following verse, in verse 10. And in doing this, he's saying, here's what God is forming. Here's what God's creating. We find here in these verses the agenda of God for this world. And so in the first part of verse 9, he kind of lays out and he says, here's who you are. Here's your identity. Here's what God is forming you into being. But then in the second half of verse 9, there's a very powerful and significant transitional statement, purpose statement. So he says, here's why God is doing the things that he is doing. In verse 9, the second half of this verse, he says, so that. So God's doing something in your life. He's doing something in your family. He's doing something in your home. He's forming you. He's creating. He's working so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What is God's purpose for our lives? What is it that God is up to? What's the grand why that transcends? It's this central idea that we were created for God's glory. We were created to put his greatness on display. The best word picture I've seen or heard from this is it says it like this, that we were created to be telescopes, not microscopes. That our lives, your life, was intended to try to convey and paint a clearer portrait of something that is vast and something that is large. In our case, with God, something that is majestic. Our lives were intended to kind of be a canvas that point toward, in this telescopic way, the greatness of God. So what we're trying to do is not take something that is really small and make it appear bigger than it is. What God's agenda for our life is, what his purpose for our life is, to actually help us to see that we're to point toward how great he is. And so when we think about the significance of this, it's important to first of all grasp that when we're trying to discover our purpose, the purpose of our life has to begin with God, not us. There was, back in the 1800s, a man named Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was a thinker, a philosopher, and he and several of his peers, kind of contemporaries of his day, they kind of piggybacked on some ideas, but from them, we know this idea came about called existential nihilism. And nihilism is kind of a fancy word that really tries to convey this idea that we should reject all godly or religious principles, and we should essentially do away with God. Nihilism would say to us that we function better without God, so we push him out. And what is created is a big vacuum or a big void. And so with nihilism, you set God aside. There is then this vast emptiness that we have to fill. And if you look right now, if you wonder, you ask this question, why is there this constant evolution, it feels as if, of new types of evil and new types of immorality, and it's all this pursuit and this desire for us as men and women to fill that empty void that's been created by the absence of God. And so nihilism and the worldview that tries to live apart from godly principles, that tries to live apart from God, ultimately it ends up being self-defeating. Why? Because God has wired within us a hunger, a desire for purpose, for transcendence, for meaning, for something that extends beyond what we can create. There was another man who came along in the 1940s, named Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, if you're familiar with him, he was a man who was a Jewish psychiatrist, doctor. He ended up being imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps for some 3 years. He survived, but his wife, his mom, his dad, his brother, they didn't. They all passed away. And through that process and that struggle that he went through, he ended up coming up with this idea called logotherapy. And the core of what the premise of his idea was this, that we're all created to need meaning and to need purpose. He went on to write the book Man's Search for Meaning, been an incredibly popular book, very well known. And what I think we discover over the course of time, though we try to push it down, though we try to reject it culturally, this need for God, it just keeps popping up. And if I could just get personal for a moment, if you in your life have tried to say, I want to try to live apart from God, I want to kind of figure life out on my own, and if to a certain extent you've wandered away from His commands, from His laws, His rules, and you find yourself itching and yearning for something deeper, I believe right here we find why that is the case. Because He has wired us, He has created us to put His greatness on display. And we find this consistently. We find Isaiah in the Old Testament telling us, he says, everyone who is called by my name and whom I created for my glory, whom I have formed, even who I have made. In the New Testament, Paul, Philippians 1:11, God sanctifies us through Christ Jesus to the glory and praise of God. 2 Thessalonians 1:9 and 10, what a day this will be when Jesus returns to the earth to be glorified in His saints and to be marveled at. Colossians 1:16, all things have been created through Him and for Him. Friends, your life's purpose does not begin with you. Our life's purpose does not begin with navel gazing and chasing our passion and wondering, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? It begins by taking our focus off of ourselves and not living as if we live in this constant mirror where we're always examining and always wondering, me. But we become telescopes and we start seeing God has created us for something greater than just to look at ourselves. After a while, we realize that's kind of depressing anyway, right? 1 Corinthians 10:31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. I love what the Westminster Catechism, the way it phrases it, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. We were placed here, not for our own glory, but for God's. Now, this word that he mentions here, this word proclaim the excellencies, note just a moment. This doesn't convey the idea of depressingly, sluggishly, kind of boringly communicating an idea. If you remember 1951, some of you, the National League championship between the New York Giants and the Los Angeles Dodgers, in this series that was taking place between the two teams, at the bottom of the ninth inning, the Giants were down by 2 runs. They had 2 men on base, and Bobby Thompson, their third baseman, got up to bat. And after that, he hits a home run. And does anybody remember, familiar with, you've heard this, the Giants win the pennant, the Giants win the pennant, the Giants win the pennant. If you haven't heard it, that was my best reenaction of it. You can go online and listen to the Giants win the pennant. It's one of the greatest call-outs in sports history, and it's known as a shot that was heard around the world. But if you've heard that or something similar to that, just try to place that in place of that if you've not heard it before. There is an excitement, there is an eagerness, there's this zeal that something great has happened. So when we want to proclaim the excellencies of God, when we want to focus on His greatness and try to put it on display, the way we convey that is not to say, there was once a guy, Jesus is his name. He came, he died, and a few days later he rose from the grave. It's not it, right? When we want to proclaim the excellencies of what He's done, there's this man named Jesus who came to this earth. He died, he was born of a virgin. He lived a perfect life. He died upon the cross. He resurrected from the grave. There's this passion that can enter into our souls when we understand our purpose. And when we really understand what God has done to help us see Him more clearly. That's the first reason. The ultimate reason that we are put here is we're created for God's glory. The second reason that goes right along with the first, we also find in these verses. If you go up a few verses to verse 4 of 1 Peter chapter 2, we see Peter saying, and coming to Him, that is Jesus, as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also, here's where I think we start cluing into what he's getting at. He says, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. There's a lot within that, but what Peter is conveying here is that God is up to something. He's building something. He's creating something. He's forming, He's shaping, He's fashioning something. So we see here the end purpose for which He does that is for His glory, so that people can more accurately see Him for who He is. But then He says, you, that is you, that is you, that is you. You're being built up as living stones. And then in verse 10, He makes this statement when He says, for you were once not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. What is God's agenda? What is God up to? Well, He wants to bring glory to Himself. The second purpose we find here, the purpose for which we were created, was first of all for the glory of God. But secondly, we're created for the good of man. If we go back to Jesus' teaching, Matthew 22, that we've looked at in this series, it's summarized well by Him. This idea that we're to love God and we're to love people. And within these verses here, we find both kind of this vertical orientation, this vertical direction, where we look up and we find that in God is our ultimate purpose. But then horizontally, we look around at the world around us and we discover that God has wired within us this purpose for the glory of God and also for the good of man. The idea of what God is up to is He wants to bring people from darkness and place them into light. He wants to miraculously take people who are sinners and turn them into saints. He wants to take people who are dead spiritually and make them alive spiritually. He wants to take people who feel perhaps now that they don't have any hope at all, they're hopeless, and turn them into people who are hope-filled. God, He has an agenda to form and to create a people who are passionate about making His name known. Now, where does that intersect with our lives? Well, the central truth is this. Here's where it intersects. Our purpose in life is to live for the glory of God and the good of man. It's just that simple. Now, I've got in front of me or with me here a tool that we all know of as a hammer. And if I take this hammer, there are several things that you can do with a hammer. And a hammer is one of those objects around your home that sometimes, if you can't find anything else, just find a hammer, because you hopefully will be able to do whatever you want to do with a hammer. Now, if we think about this, though, for just a moment, if I've got this hammer, and I may work up the courage to do this before the second service, but we've got a guitarist in our church. We've got several great guitarists. David Brandorf, if you've ever watched him up here on the guitar, he's incredible. If I go over there to the guitar, and I take this hammer, and I hold the guitar in my hand, the big impediment there is the guitarist. Like, I wouldn't know what I was doing. But if I took this hammer, and I put it into somebody's hands, put it into David's hands even. And I said, David, would you take this hammer and play this guitar? It's probably going to be very frustrating. Probably going to be a very challenging thing to do. Why? Because the tool, the purpose for which this was created was not to play a guitar. And it's possible maybe you could practice and kind of learn. If you Google online, there's probably somebody out there that plays a guitar with a hammer. I get it, but stick with me here. It would be very difficult, right? To play the guitar, to make the right music with a tool that has the wrong purpose. In your life right now, if you feel frustrated, if you feel an emptiness, if you feel a yearning, if you feel that there's something that should be there but it's not there, there's something that's amiss. The first question to ask is this: what is my purpose? And to the extent that you've seen yourself as a tool, as a vessel perhaps, but the purpose that you've been trying to fulfill is not aligned with the purpose for which God has created you. If the purpose we're seeking in life is our own personal benefit, our own glory, our own advancement, if we've not started with this worldview that begins with this idea that we're created for God and His glory, if we've missed that, it's going to be difficult to ever have good music, ever settle into a rhythm where we sense meaning and we sense significance. And so it leads to this final question: how do we practically begin to get on God's wavelength and pursue His glory and pursue the good of man? I'm going to give you two practical ways we can do this, and these are things that I would just challenge you to consider. These don't speak to us at a real kind of granular way, very specific. You need to be a medical doctor and go overseas and do missions in this country. These are just two very general building blocks for us to discover and begin walking in the purpose for which God has created us. The primary thing that we need to do is that we need to align our life plans with our life purpose. And two practical ways that we can begin doing that. The first is this: if you're here and you say, I want God's purpose for my life, here's the first and fundamental thing that has to happen. Number one, surrender. Surrender. To begin praying this prayer for God's will in your life above your own. There is an idea that says what you should do in your life is follow your heart. Let me say, for anybody, teenagers, people in your 20s, at some point you'll realize that is terrible, terrible advice. It sounds good on a bumper sticker. It sounds good in kind of this naive Pollyanna sort of world. But what ends up happening inevitably for a person who follows their heart, they follow something that is, by its nature, deceptive. And in fact, even the studies have been done, people who go into life and their primary desire is for pleasure and fun, what they find is that those people end up living far less happier lives than the people who have looked for meaning and found it in God. And so if you're on the precipice of saying, well, I'd really like to begin discovering what God's purpose for my life is, it sounds incredibly simple. But if every day, in every circumstance you go through that you're struggling with, you begin to say, God, the first thing that I want to do is surrender my life to yours. Surrender my dreams to your will. Surrender my plans to your will. Surrender those things that are dear and precious to me to you. It doesn't mean that we have to forfeit them necessarily or give them up, but it does mean that we have to have a willingness to say, God, I want your will above my own. I want your purpose in my life above my own. And if we have that heart that says, God, I hope you would never, ever, 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 ever call me to give up hunting. I don't know what your thing is. But if we have that heart that says, God, I hope you would never do this, but if you were, I want to surrender that. It's this heart that says, whatever is dear to us, whatever we're passionate about, we lay that before the Lord and we trust him with that. And there's this heart posture of surrender that says, I don't want to hold anything dear to me. I don't want to have anything that becomes, as we looked at in the first message, a broken cistern. I don't want to spend the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years of my life pursuing one dead, empty thing after another. And if right now you're finding your sense of being and your identity and how accomplished or successful you are, how high you have dollars stacked up, how well you've performed, that would be the thing that you need to surrender. And again, it may not be you forfeit that, you give that away. If you do want to give that away, we have a building project going on right now, and feel free to bring that money to the church body. But it's just saying, God, I don't want anything to be more important than you. Let's surrender. You can do that right now, even as I'm talking. So surrender is the first building block that puts us in a position to begin moving into our life's purpose. The second is to simply serve, to serve, and to begin making this a regular rhythm of your life. To serve specifically, to do things for others that make you uncomfortable or require you to sacrifice. This is very much not of this world, but it is very much of Jesus. If you look at Jesus' purpose and what he came to do, he came to give his life as a ransom for many. He came to sacrifice. He came to serve. And if within us we say, well, I want to begin discovering God's purpose for my life, if we make it a consistent, regular routine to try to serve, to try to do things that make us feel uncomfortable, what surrender does is it gets us in alignment with God's purpose for his glory. What service does is it gets us in alignment with God's purpose for the good of man. It orients us away from ourselves and toward others. And again, the powerful thing about this is, the ironic thing about this, is that when we begin to give life away, is exactly the moment when we begin to find it. And I would challenge you sometimes to go look at the teaching of Jesus, Mark 8, when he calls people to become his disciples. I mean, there's this consistent message that Jesus gives that it's actually in the losing of our lives that we begin to find them. It's actually in the giving away of our lives that we begin to gain them. What surrender and service do is they create space for God to occupy that vacuum. That vacuum that exists, that God has wired us with this hunger and this desire, this appetite for purpose and for meaning. It invites God to be the one who comes in and provides that very thing for us. And I'm going to close with this, that God can use you to make a lasting, eternal difference in someone's life. And if you believe today that you have been created for a purpose, that God is a divine designer, and friends, your life is not here by accident. And the worth of your life is not determined by your age. And that whether you're young on the front end of life and you think, what I have to contribute, I'm just young and I don't know, I'm just kind of figuring out this family thing. Or if you're moving toward the back end of life and most of the best years of your life, those productive years of your life are in the past. Either way, wherever you are, know this, that God has created you, He's placed you where you are for a purpose. Two pictures I close with. One is, I just graduated in May of 2000. I just graduated college, and I went to it was a Christian conference called Passion Conferences, and out in a big field outside of Memphis, Tennessee, there were some 40,000 college students there. And through the course of the day, different speakers came and gave different messages. And one message in particular, I remember the man who came and delivered this message, wasn't really familiar with him at the time, but he talked about this idea of not wasting our lives. And he referenced what he had recently read in a Reader's Digest magazine about a couple. And he said this about this couple. The couple's names were Bob and Penny. It says, Bob and Penny took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect shells. And remember the message he gave. The main call was this: don't spend your life collecting shells. Don't live so that you can get to the place where you're finally comfortable enough to say, you're going to collect shells. And I remember what an impression that made on me at that time. Here's what I've discovered 4 years later, is that there is a desire, I think, that lurks within all of us to go collect shells. Right? Just kind of ride it out, live comfortably. But when we look at the call that's given to us, the model that's given to us in Jesus, I think we turn our attention away from Bob and Penny. We turn to a man as an example named Adoniram Judson. Adoniram Judson, born in the late 1700s, coming from a fairly affluent family. His father was a pastor, and that day allowed him to live a life of privilege. And went through a number of things, but by the time he was 25 years old, he said, I'm going to go and I'm going to give my life as a missionary to the Burmese people in India. And so Mr. Judson, he did that. And as he went there, the narrative we would want to hear from that point would be this: that God began to bless his life with health and wealth and fame and fortune and favor. And what happened is he lost his first wife, then his second. While he was there, he buried 6 children. He spent 21 months in prison. He labored 6 years among the people without one single convert. His original goal when he went there was to plant a church of 100 believers. Well, when Adoniram Judson died, estimates vary. Some people on the conservative end say that there were as many as 8,000 people who were headed to heaven when they died because of that one man. Other estimates say that it was over 20,000. At the end of our lives, we have to ask the question, do we want to be a Bob or a Penny? Not that there's anything sinful about collecting shells. Say, collect shells. Just don't make that the sum total of what our lives are about. Or do we want to have what was in Adoniram Judson? To say only one life, C.T. Studd, only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last. That we give ourselves to something that lasts beyond the grave. It lasts beyond land, it lasts beyond possessions, it lasts beyond anything that we can touch or taste or feel or work for on this earth. It's something that is eternal. And friends, God invites us into that today. Father, I pray in the great name of Jesus that you help us tap into the purpose for which you have created us. It is first and foremost for your glory. To love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. It is secondly for the good of man. To love our neighbor as ourselves. Would you help us to be people who have a passion for your purpose? I pray this in the great name of Jesus. Amen.